The narrative unveils a historical perspective of the Zionist movement and its ambitions in establishing the State of Israel. Emerging in the late 1800s, under the leadership of figures like Theodor Herzl, the Zionist movement aimed to create a homeland for the Jewish people. In 1897, the First Zionist Congress convened, leading to the establishment of the World Zionist Organization, with participation growing from 117 to 900 groups in a year. However, the decision to choose Palestine as the desired location for this Jewish state posed challenges, as the region was already inhabited by a predominantly non-Jewish population, mainly Muslims and Christians, who were also the primary landowners. Notably, Zionist leaders appeared open to using financial or coercive means to displace non-Jewish communities from the proposed Jewish state. The United States played a pivotal role in these early Zionist endeavors. As early as 1887, President Grover Cleveland appointed a Jewish ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, the governing authority in Palestine at the time, highlighting the increasing influence of Zionists in American political circles. During the early 1900s, Zionist organizations began to emerge in major U.S. cities, actively promoting the concept of a Jewish homeland. Over time, they began to exert their influence on the U.S. Congress. They also leveraged the media, including Yiddish newspapers and various societies, to vigorously advocate for their cause. Prominent individuals like Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter played significant roles in advancing the Zionist agenda, even engaging in covert political activities to support it. Ethical concerns were raised regarding these activities, particularly with a sitting Supreme Court justice's involvement. Nevertheless, the Zionist movement in the United States continued to gain prominence. Surprisingly, it has come to light that Louis Brandeis, a respected Supreme Court justice, was a member of a covert society known as the Parashim. This exclusive group, rooted in Harvard's Menorah Society, played a key role in advancing the Zionist agenda, both within the United States and internationally. This revelation, first reported by Israeli professor Dr. Sarah Schmidt in 1978, and later detailed by author Peter Gross, provides a unique perspective on the Zionists' actions and motivations. World War I, widely regarded by historians as a complex and seemingly unnecessary conflict, resulted in immense devastation, claiming the lives of around 14 million individuals, including 270,000 Americans. Additionally, over 1,200 American citizens who opposed the war were subjected to imprisonment, some enduring years of confinement. Various reasons were publicly attributed to President Woodrow Wilson's change of heart, which led to the United States' involvement in the war. These reasons included Germany's submarine warfare, the sinking of the American ship Lusitania by Germany, and the diplomatic crisis known as the Zimmermann Telegram. Historians have also pointed to pro-British propaganda and economic factors as contributing factors. However, what often remains overlooked is the role played by Zionism in shaping America's entry into the war. Documentary evidence demonstrates that the Zionists actively lobbied for the U.S. to align with Britain in exchange for British support for their aspirations to colonize Palestine. From the outset of the Zionist movement, it became clear that achieving their goal of establishing a Jewish state on land already inhabited by non-Jews necessitated the backing of one of the world's great powers. Initially, efforts were made to secure Ottoman support, as the Ottoman Empire controlled Palestine at the time. However, these efforts were met with refusal. Turning to Britain as an alternative, the Zionists encountered initial reluctance. Notable British experts on the Middle East, including Gertrude Bell and Lord George Curzon, emphasized the Arab nature of Palestine and the sanctity of Jerusalem for all three major monotheistic faiths. They also highlighted the existence of a significant Arab population in Palestine. The turning point came when Britain became deeply entrenched in World War I, particularly during the disastrous year of 1916, marked by heavy casualties. At this juncture, the Zionists played their trump card. Previously, they had focused on religious and idealistic arguments, but now they wielded a powerful motivator. They informed the British government that American Zionists would advocate for U.S. involvement in the war on the side of Britain, provided that Britain, in turn, supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1917, British Foreign Minister Lord Arthur Balfour issued a letter to Zionist leader Lord Rothschild, known as the Balfour Declaration. This letter expressed Britain's willingness to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. However, the declaration contained a caveat, ensuring that the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine would not be prejudiced. At that time, these non-Jewish communities constituted 92% of Palestine's population. The text underscores the role of American Zionists, especially Louis Brandeis, in solidifying the alliance between British and American Zionists, ultimately contributing to Britain's support for the Zionist cause. Although the Balfour Declaration was not an unreserved endorsement of Zionism, it was viewed as a significant breakthrough that played a pivotal role in the eventual creation of Israel. Moreover, the 1936 article by Samuel Landman in World Jewry provides detailed insights into secret negotiations between the British government and Zionist leaders in 1916, suggesting that American Zionists also played a significant role in thwarting an early peace settlement with the Ottoman Empire. The aftermath of World War I was a pivotal time for Zionists, as they sought to shape the future of the Middle East during the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. They were instrumental in steering the discussions and securing British control over Palestine under a mandate system. However, the influence of certain Zionists, including Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, came under scrutiny due to their positions and their involvement in advancing the Zionist agenda in ways that raised ethical questions. On the other side of the spectrum, there were those who voiced opposition to this vision. Distinguished American Christians in the Middle East, like Harry Emerson Fosdick and Henry Sloane Coffin, were among those who stood against Zionism. Their concerns centered on the protection of Arab self-determination and the rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Moreover, in the U.S. diplomatic circles, there was growing opposition to the Zionist position, especially from figures like William Westerman, who believed that the Arab stance was more in line with President Wilson's principle of self-determination. During this period, President Wilson commissioned the King-Crane Commission to investigate the situation in Palestine. Its findings contradicted the Zionist position by highlighting the potential harm a distinctly Jewish state could cause to non-Jewish communities in the region. The report stressed that Palestinians should be allowed to determine their own destiny, free from external pressures. As these recommendations ran contrary to Zionist interests, they were concealed until after the peace accords were finalized. This suppression raised questions about the extent of Zionist influence at the time. A pro-Israel historian even observed that with the burial of the King-Crane report, a significant obstacle to Zionist objectives was removed. The idea behind Zionism was the creation of a homeland for Jews worldwide to escape anti-Semitism, often coupled with the belief in a mass ingathering of exiles. However, when it became evident that Jews were not immigrating to Palestine in sufficient numbers, various methods were employed to boost immigration. The narrative also uncovers instances where fervent Zionists allegedly exploited or concocted anti-Semitic incidents to gather support for their cause and motivate Jewish immigrants to move to the designated homeland. One striking example is the case of Zionist leaders sabotaging efforts to find secure havens for Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Their opposition to such initiatives that did not include Palestine raised questions about the extent to which political agendas were prioritized over human lives. One particularly surprising revelation is the transfer agreement of 1933, in which some Zionists collaborated with the Nazis, enabling Jews to transfer their capital to Palestine. This agreement included rejecting a boycott against Germany, causing controversy and dividing opinions among Jews worldwide. The extent of this collaboration has raised difficult ethical questions. In the mid-20th century, the Zionist aspiration for a massive Jewish migration to a single state collided with the wishes of many Iraqi Jews who sought to maintain their lives in their ancestral homeland. The then chief rabbi of Iraq encapsulated the majority sentiment when he voiced Iraqi Jews' steadfast opposition to Zionism. This opposition was rooted in their firm belief in their Iraqi identity and the history of peaceful coexistence they had shared with their Arab neighbors for over a millennium. In the eyes of many Iraqi Jews, there was no distinction between Jewish and Arab components of the nation. They considered themselves an integral part of the larger Iraqi community. However, some Zionist factions resorted to clandestine and morally dubious tactics in an attempt to induce Iraqi Jews to emigrate to Israel. These tactics included planting explosives in Iraqi synagogues and other public places, such as the U.S. Information Service Library in Iraq. This unsettling approach was designed to create an atmosphere of fear and insecurity. Its goal was to convince Iraqi Jews that they were no longer safe in Iraq, and that their only option was to leave. To add another layer to this strategy, propaganda leaflets began circulating, urging Jewish communities to flee to Israel. This orchestrated campaign aimed to paint Arab nations as hostile and dangerous to Jewish residents, thereby driving them out of their homeland. Naim Giladi, a Jewish Iraqi author who personally experienced these events, offered a rare and critical perspective on this chapter of history. He coined the term cruel Zionism to describe the tactics used, emphasizing the severe coercion that was exerted. Giladi's account underscores the fact that Jewish communities from Islamic lands did not emigrate willingly to Israel. They were pushed to leave their homes. Tragically, some of the tactics employed included Jews turning against their fellow Jewish communities, an unsettling and divisive aspect of the larger Zionist movement. The most troubling aspect is that these actions were not solely driven by the desire for Jewish self-determination, but were also used to buy time for the acquisition of more Arab lands. This complicated internal struggle, filled with ethical dilemmas, raises profound questions about the methods employed in the name of a political and ideological cause. The shadow cast by these actions creates a controversial and dark stain on the history of Israel, underscoring the multifaceted nature of its creation and early years. In the early 20th century, American Zionists encountered a complex set of challenges and reactions as they sought to advance their vision of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. These challenges prompted a shift in their tactics, with many American Zionists moving away from overtly pushing for a Jewish state to a strategy that focused on the creation of Jewish institutions in Palestine, a practice historian Naomi Cohen referred to as Palestinianism. Several factors contributed to this shift, including the rise of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and the economic hardship brought on by the Great Depression in the 1930s. Moreover, there was a growing aversion to militant nationalistic movements following World War I. By shifting away from a public call for a Jewish state, American Zionists hoped to sidestep accusations of disloyalty or dual allegiance, and to better align with the democratic principles championed after the war. At this time, not only were Jewish voices against the creation of a Jewish state heard, but some non-Jewish writers also voiced concerns about the non-democratic agenda of establishing a Jewish state in a region where the majority was non-Jewish. Instead of advocating for a Jewish state, the focus shifted to creating Jewish institutions in Palestine. Initiatives like the Hebrew University in Jerusalem were promoted as acts of altruism rather than colonial ambitions, aligning more favorably with American sentiment during this period, which was marked by philanthropy and admiration for philanthropists. American Zionists recognized the pivotal role the United States could play in their objectives. Zionist leaders like David Ben-Gurion emphasized the critical importance of American support for their cause. They considered the American Jewish community and the Zionist movement as potent tools in their efforts. Even during World War II, Zionists like Moshe Chertok understood that America's influence on the global stage would be decisive and focused on harnessing the significant power wielded by American Jews. The direct precursor to the modern pro-Israel lobby took shape in 1939 under the leadership of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver. He founded the American Zionist Emergency Council, AZEC, which by 1943 had a budget of $500,000. Moreover, the United Jewish Appeal, established in 1939, allowed Zionists access to immense financial resources, with contributions soaring to $150 million by 1948, an extraordinary sum in those times. With such substantial funding, AZEC embarked on a massive campaign that aimed to influence all segments of American society, ranging from Congress members and clergy to journalists and educators. Local committees were established in Jewish communities across the nation. Form letters and anti-Zionist lecture tours were used to disrupt opposition. The sheer magnitude of this effort was reflected in its ability to mobilize 27 U.S. senators, organize massive demonstrations, and effectively sway public opinion. Under the AZEC umbrella, grassroots Zionist action groups proliferated, with over 400 local committees spanning 76 state and regional branches. Subsidized books and academic studies promoting the Zionist agenda reached a broad audience, and a widespread campaign to influence public opinion infiltrated nearly every facet of American life. This powerful Zionist campaign extended even to the religious sphere, with efforts to manufacture Christian support for Zionism. Secret Zionist funds were used to revive the American-Palestine Committee, a predominantly Protestant group initially founded in 1932 by a Zionist organization member. This group garnered support from influential non-Jewish Americans who were motivated by the desire to aid people in need. By skillfully connecting the refugee issue with Palestine as the purported solution, Zionists gained the support of well-intentioned Americans, who were largely unaware of the impending displacement of hundreds of thousands of non-Jews during Israel's formation. In this environment, dissent against Zionism faced significant obstacles. Anti-Zionist Jewish Americans struggled to obtain comparable funding and were often deterred by fear of intense personal attacks. Hostility towards those who opposed the Zionist agenda was not uncommon, with individuals in powerful positions, such as Congressman Emanuel Seller, openly expressing their hostility. The Zionist movement's ability to harness and direct the resources of the American Jewish community, as well as its capacity to exert influence across various sectors of society, marks the genesis of the modern pro-Israel lobby. However, this historical account also underscores the significant and complex dynamics at play, revealing the various layers and methods employed in shaping American support for Israel. The Zionist colonization efforts in Palestine during the early 20th century were characterized by a dual strategy to clear the land of its Muslim and Christian inhabitants and replace them with Jewish immigrants. Given that Muslims and Christians made up over 95% of Palestine's population, this was a formidable challenge. Zionists initially aimed to purchase land and encourage the existing inhabitants to emigrate voluntarily. However, when this approach proved insufficient, they resorted to the use of violence to force the indigenous population out. The indigenous Palestinian response to these colonial initiatives included sporadic acts of violence, a predictable reaction to the threat of displacement from their ancestral lands. As the Zionist land acquisition and immigration project expanded, Palestinian resistance also escalated. In response to these challenges, Zionist leaders formed terrorist groups aimed at combating Palestinians and the British colonial authorities. One such group was led by future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who later boasted about bringing terrorism to the Middle East and the world at large. By the time the British decided to relinquish their control over Palestine in 1947, the Zionist project had managed to increase the Jewish population of Palestine to about 30%, and their land ownership to approximately 7%. With the fate of Palestine now in the hands of the United Nations, UN, one might have expected the UN, guided by its principle of self-determination of peoples, to support fair democratic elections, allowing the inhabitants to determine their own independent country. Contrary to these expectations, the Zionists lobbied for a General Assembly resolution that would grant them a disproportionately large portion of Palestine, about 55%, although their long-term plans were to acquire the entire territory. This move was vehemently opposed by the U.S. State Department, which considered it contrary to fundamental American principles and detrimental to U.S. interests. Loy Henderson, the director of the State Department's Office of Near Eastern and African Affairs, consistently advised against supporting a Jewish state in Palestine. He emphasized the adverse impact this decision would have on local sentiments, U.S. interests, and democratic principles, fearing that it would undermine American moral standing worldwide. Henderson believed that such a partition would need to be enforced by military means, and most importantly, that it contradicted the principles of self-determination and majority rule. Henderson was not alone in his opposition. His views were shared by numerous members of the Foreign Service and the State Department, who had worked extensively on Near Eastern issues. The CIA, Ambassador Henry F. Grady, Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff all opposed Zionism on the grounds that it would jeopardize U.S. interests in the Middle East and violate democratic principles. The Joint Chiefs even expressed concerns that the Zionist agenda would embroil the U.S. in a series of operations contrary to American interests. The head of the State Department's Division of Near Eastern Affairs, Gordon P. Merriam, also argued that supporting partition without the consent of the affected populations would violate the principles of self-determination embedded in the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations Declaration, and the United Nations Charter. Merriam anticipated that, without consent, the situation would lead to bloodshed and chaos. An internal State Department memorandum accurately predicted that Israel would come into existence through armed aggression disguised as defense. This prediction was rooted in the understanding that the Jews would be the actual aggressors against the Arabs, while framing their actions as self-defense. In response to Arab counterattacks, they would appeal to the United Nations, portraying themselves as victims of armed aggression. President Harry Truman's decision to support the Zionist partition plan for Palestine, despite strong opposition from within his administration, was influenced by a combination of factors. Clark Clifford, Truman's political advisor, believed that the Jewish vote and financial contributions were essential for winning the upcoming presidential election, and supporting the partition plan would secure this support. His opponent, Thomas Dewey, took a similar stance for similar reasons, creating a situation where both major candidates endorsed the partition plan for electoral considerations. This electoral calculus did not sit well with many high-ranking officials within Truman's administration. Secretary of State George Marshall, a highly respected World War II general and author of the Marshall Plan, was particularly furious about the decision. He saw the policy shift as a transparent political maneuver to gain votes, which he believed would seriously diminish the dignity of the office of the president. Marshall contended that U.S. foreign policy should be based on national interests, not domestic political considerations. Truman's Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, shared this view, condemning the policy shift as a concession to squalid political purposes. He believed that U.S. policy should be driven by the country's national interests rather than influenced by domestic political considerations. Officials like Forrestal were concerned that the influence of a lobby, in this case the Zionist lobby, should not be allowed to put American national security at risk. Reports by the National Security Council and the CIA emphasized the acute threat that the turmoil in Palestine posed to the security of the United States. The strategic importance of the Middle East, particularly its oil resources, was another primary concern. George F. Kennan, the State Department's Director of Policy Planning, issued a top-secret document that warned of the damage the partition plan would do to the United States and how it could benefit the Soviet Union. Kermit Roosevelt, an intelligence agent and Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, expressed his deep concern about the role of Zionist Jews in promoting American support for the partition of Palestine. He believed that a foreign policy based on national interests, rather than partisan ones, was essential. Roosevelt predicted that the national interests of the United States would increasingly clash with those of the proposed Jewish state in Palestine. Despite this opposition within Truman's administration, the president chose to support the Zionist partition plan. The decisive role played by the Zionist lobby, driven by strong financial connections and the promise of political support, weighed heavily in Truman's decision-making. Abraham Feinberg, a wealthy businessman, was instrumental in facilitating these financial connections, providing funding for Truman's campaign and helping him secure the presidency. In addition to financial incentives, Figures within Truman's circle, such as David K. Niles and Eddie Jacobson, who had access to the president, were able to convey Zionist concerns and influence his decisions. While the influence of the Zionist lobby played a significant role in shaping Truman's stance on Palestine, it also led to a significant shift in American foreign policy, with long-lasting consequences for the Middle East and the world. Some members of Truman's administration and career diplomats believed that Truman's motivation for supporting the partition plan was primarily driven by domestic political considerations rather than a strategic analysis of national interests. This shift in policy significantly impacted the United States' relationship with the Middle East and set the stage for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that continues to this day. Following the UN General Assembly's recommendation for the partition of Palestine, Zionists launched an extensive campaign to ensure that the plan would gain the two-thirds majority required to pass. They utilized various tactics to persuade or pressure numerous nations into supporting the partition recommendation. Economic and political pressure. Zionists like Robert Nathan, who had close ties with the Jewish Agency, acknowledged using various tools at their disposal. This included telling some delegations that failure to vote for partition could lead to a withdrawal of economic aid. Financier and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch warned France that it might lose U.S. aid if it voted against partition. Top White House aide David Niles orchestrated pressure on Liberia through businessman Harvey Firestone, who threatened to cancel his planned expansion in the country if Liberia didn't vote in favor. Delegates from Latin American countries were informed that the Pan American Highway construction project might receive more support if they voted for partition. Incentives and gifts. Delegates' wives received mink coats as an inducement, although some refused these gifts. Costa Rica's President José Figueres was reportedly offered a blank checkbook, and Haiti was promised economic aid in exchange for changing its original vote opposing partition. Intimidation and threats. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, along with senators and presidential advisor Clark Clifford, threatened the Philippines with consequences. The Philippines delegate had initially given a speech opposing partition, citing the importance of people's right to determine their political future and preserve territorial integrity. However, he later voted in favor of partition after intense Zionist pressure. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, which created the partition plan. While this resolution is frequently cited in discussions about Israel's establishment, it had limited legal impact. General Assembly resolutions are not binding on member states. Instead, the resolution requested the Security Council to take necessary measures for its implementation, which the Security Council did not do. Legally, the General Assembly resolution was a recommendation and did not create any states. What the resolution did accomplish was an escalation of conflict in Palestine. Within months, over 413,000 people had been forced out by Zionist forces. Zionists had been preparing for war before the UN vote and had acquired significant weaponry through various networks, including illicit gun-running operations in the United States under multiple front groups. On May 15, 1948, Zionists declared the establishment of the State of Israel without defining its boundaries or drafting a constitution. This announcement led to a regional conflict, with 5 Arab armies joining the fighting. Contrary to common perceptions, Israeli forces had a numerical advantage over the combined Arab and Palestinian forces. A temporary ceasefire was eventually brokered by the UN, during which Israel acquired even more armaments. Count Folke Bernadotte, a UN mediator dispatched to negotiate an end to the violence, was assassinated by Israeli forces. After the war, Israel came into existence on 78% of Palestine through the displacement of non-Jewish residents, leading to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The passing of the partition resolution in November 1947 led to a series of violent events that were predicted by State Department and Pentagon analysts. Prior to the involvement of any Arab armies, there were at least 33 documented massacres of Palestinian villages, illustrating the brutal methods used by Zionist forces to establish the State of Israel. Many of these Zionist militias had previously engaged in acts of terrorism in the region. These massacres resulted in horrifying accounts, with descriptions provided by both Palestinians and Israelis. An Israeli eyewitness described the massacre in the village of Al-Dawayima, where children were killed by having their heads smashed with sticks, and women were raped and then shot. Another Palestinian woman testified that her 9-month pregnant sister was shot and had her stomach cut open with a butcher knife. One of the more well-documented massacres occurred in the neutral Palestinian village of Deir Yassin in April 1948, before any Arab armies joined the conflict. A Swiss Red Cross representative, who was among the first to arrive at the scene, found 254 dead, including 145 women, 35 of whom were pregnant. Witnesses reported that families were lined up, men, women, grandparents, children, and even infants, and shot. According to reports, the attackers from 2 Zionist militias coordinated the attack on Deir Yassin with the main Zionist forces. The Red Cross representative reported witnessing Zionist militia members entering houses with guns and knives, while some carried blood-covered daggers. The scene was compared to SS troops in Athens. British Assistant Inspector General Richard Catling reported sexual atrocities committed by Zionist forces during these massacres. Young schoolgirls were raped and later killed, and old women were also subjected to molestation. The attack on Deir Yassin was coordinated by the Irgun and Lehi militias, led by Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, both of whom would later become prime ministers of Israel. Begin, head of the Irgun militia, praised the operation in a message to his troops, referring to the attack as a splendid act of conquest. Menachem Begin later embarked on a tour of the United States, which was sponsored by prominent supporters of Zionism, including playwright Ben Hecht. Despite his known violent activities, Begin's visa was allowed by Truman over the objections of the State Department. In an interview for American television, Begin openly admitted his involvement in terrorism. When asked how it felt to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East, Begin proudly stated, "In the Middle East. In all the world." This acknowledgement highlights the significance of these events in shaping the history and trajectory of the Middle East. During the mid-20th century, a number of groups in the United States operated clandestinely to support Zionist paramilitary activities in Palestine. These groups often used deceptive names and tactics to raise funds and build support for their activities. Here, I will provide information about some of these groups and their actions. A. Irgun Delegation, Peter Bergson. A covert Irgun delegation operated in the U.S. from the late 1930s through 1948, under various front organizations, including the Emergency Committee to Save European Jewry and American Friends of a Jewish Palestine. The primary leader was Hillel Kook, who assumed the alias Peter Bergson upon arriving in the U.S. The group is often referred to as the Bergson Boys. Other key figures included Yitzhak Ben-Ami, Ari Jabotinsky, and Meir Kahan, who later founded the Jewish Defense League, JDL. The delegation's main purpose was to raise money for Irgun activities in Palestine, although this fact was unknown to many of its high-level supporters. These supporters included prominent figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dorothy Parker, Herbert Hoover, and others. The FBI suspected the illegal fundraising activities of these front groups, but failed to produce evidence. The Irgun delegation engaged in a range of public activities in the U.S., including lobbying Congress and the White House, organizing marches and rallies, and producing cultural events. They pushed for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Notably, they lobbied for the creation of a Jewish army of stateless and Palestinian Jews to fight alongside the Allies against the Nazis. B. Rabbi Korf and the Political Action Committee for Palestine, PACP. Another front group, the PCP, was established by Orthodox Rabbi Baruch Korf. He had close ties to various congressmen and used PR tactics similar to the Irgun delegation. He arranged a staged visit to England and Palestine by former Congressman Joseph Clark Baldwin, producing an official report to influence U.S. policy. Korf was also involved in a terrorist plot against the British Foreign Office that was discovered in 1946. British intelligence found that Jewish terrorists, including Korf, planned to assassinate the British foreign minister. They intended to drop bombs and threatening leaflets on London, but the plot was foiled by a young American aviator, Reginald Gilbert. Korf was arrested, but later had the charges dropped, with help from his influential allies. The Sonneborn Institute. The Sonneborn Institute was the secret American arm of the Haganah, the main Zionist paramilitary group in Palestine. Founded by Rudolph G. Sonneborn and David Ben-Gurion, it aimed to raise funds and support the Haganah's activities. It was involved in arms trafficking and organized Zionist youth groups, which sometimes helped load guns onto boats bound for Palestine. U.S. authorities tried to curb these illegal activities, including arms trafficking, as they were deemed detrimental to U.S. national security. However, the Sonneborn Institute, like other Zionist front groups, had influential friends in high places and faced minimal prosecution. The exact amount of money raised for Zionism during this period remains uncertain, but it is believed to have been substantial. The Jewish Agency for Israel alone raised the equivalent of $3.5 billion in today's dollars between 1939 and May 1948. These front groups played a significant role in mobilizing American support for the Zionist cause during this time. In the post-World War II era, Zionist organizations embarked on a clandestine campaign to influence Jewish survivors in Europe to migrate to Palestine. Central to their objectives was the need to increase the Jewish population in Palestine. The founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, expressed this ambition, emphasizing the essence of Zionism as a population endeavor. However, convincing Jewish survivors to uproot themselves and resettle in Palestine was a formidable task, especially when many of them preferred to remain in Europe. The survivors were seen as a crucial reserve for potential immigration, and the Zionists were determined to funnel them to Palestine. To achieve this, various tactics were employed, ranging from psychological manipulation to coercive measures. These efforts, at times, included confiscating food rations, forcing eviction from camps, revoking legal protections, and even physical violence. The Jewish Brigade of the British Army, a unit long sought after by the Zionists, played a significant role in these activities. Brigade members served as clandestine emissaries of the Zionist movement and embarked on a mission to gather Jewish children hidden in monasteries and with non-Jewish families throughout Europe.